Revisited. Let me introduce our moderator and welcome him to the stage. Kılıç Buğra Kanat is the director of the SETA Foundation's Washington, D.C. office, and here he comes now.
Thank you very much. We are back in our panels, and this is Sunday, almost noon right now. I know that we have audience here, we have audience online, on Twitter and YouTube. They are following us. This is the part on mastering strategic communication and thinking about research. And we have academics and we have three distinguished guests, both academics and practitioners at the same time. So we will discuss how to do research, what are the challenges in conducting research in strategic communication. And you have the bios in front of you, so I will not go into details because we have 40 minutes. So we will just start with Derina. Go ahead. Derina will talk about challenges in strategic communication research.
I usually, people think of research in terms of the research methods, but this is not at all what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about what is happening in the field that really challenge what we do and how we think about practice and not about the research methods. Because that is what research is about. It is about challenging our assumptions or confirming our assumptions, whatever that might be. To identify where these issues are, I like to return to the three levels of strategic communication as a diagnostic tool, and those levels are the macro level, which is the societal level, the meso or organizational level, and then the micro level, or the level where communication is actually taking place. So I'll use those three categories for my analysis very briefly, but I think it's very important before we go there to understand generally, however, that old notions of strategy as set in stone needs to go out the window. Strategy is no longer something that we can predict is going to be successful, or that we have control over the outcomes, and I'll explain that a little bit later. So first of all, it's important to understand that communication outcomes are unpredictable. I like to think of communication at this moment as a tornado. It sucks up the messages, and in that tornado there are components where different groups form. Some people communicate out, some people communicate in, some people don't communicate. So it is really not a linear process at all. I think anybody who still teaches communication as a transmission model should not be teaching. So I think that is a very important thing to understand, that it is chaotic. The other thing is that we need to approach it as an outside-in approach, not as inside-out, where the organization or the entity knows best. You can only be successful if you understand your stakeholders, and if your stakeholders react and interact with you. So the whole idea that organizations control their strategy to the exclusion of their stakeholders is simply a fallacy. Stakeholders allow us to exist and allow us to be successful. The other thing that we need to understand is that strategy oftentimes, and we ignore that strategy emerges from practice. Let me give you a simple example. A few years ago in my current position, I created a position for a budget manager about 5 years ago. And so eventually the other colleges adopted it. And so we sort of established the practice. And then an administrator came in and said, no, I who's not even part of the colleges, need to define what that role should be. And that's okay, but the fact is that we establish through our practice what that is, and so that it gives him the opportunity to critique it and so forth. So this is an example of, instead of that position being predetermined beforehand, we created it through practice. So the strategy emerged through practice and not from the top down. That's a simple example, but I think that is very important to remember, because we often forget that the people, our frontline people who work on a daily basis with people, establish practice. Strategic communication can and should change on a dime. That is very important. We cannot be resistant to changing our practice because it's written up somewhere in a strategy. We need to change. And then I think another important aspect that we all need to remember is that political systems affect the ability to practice strategic communication. For instance, we did several studies a few years ago of 48 countries, and we determined that in Europe it's a much more consensus-based model, where the entity and the stakeholders create consensus, and that changes the way that they practice strategic communication. In South Africa, and in Africa in general, the stakeholders determine what the organization should do because of the political system, particularly in South and Southern Africa. And in the United States, the preference is put on the capitalist system. So the organization and or the business give preference over workers. So in each of those instances, there's a difference in how you would practice strategic communication. I have some other ideas, but maybe we should move on. I think that's about.
Just following up what you said, let's make it a little more interactive. One sentence is extremely important: strategy emerges from practice. And when we study strategy in political science, it is a little different, right? It is one of the key things in political science is the operations and tactics shouldn't determine the strategy. Strategy needs to be top down. So do you think in communication and in some other spheres, the way that they approach strategy is different or contradictory?
I think it is. You need to direct your strategy at the people, at how the people on the front line experience it. Say, for instance, in political communication.
Sure.
Your campaign workers have experiences that could not be imagined by the people who determine the strategy, and might have feedback that is incredibly important. So if you do not consider that, then you continue on a strategic path that hasn't considered what your frontline campaign workers experience and do. So there need to be that constant give and take between the people who execute and the people who strategize.
Yeah, that's important, because when we are talking about, for example, US-Syria strategy, we usually say that because of a lack of strategy, the people on the ground runs the operation, and operational success determines the strategy. And according to many military experts, that is something that it shouldn't be, right? So maybe there should be a middle ground between top-down and bottom-up strategy and practice. There should be something in the middle that the people on the ground will inform the leaders maybe, and leaders will kind of find a way to shape the strategy.
To adapt, absolutely, yes. It's a dialogue, and that's why I think it's very important to understand that it's not set in stone.
Yeah. And then strategizing strategic communication from words to numbers and pictures. This is really interesting, and please tell us a little.
Well, let me follow from where you left.
Can you press?
Let me follow from where you left. I'm using the word strategizing because I'm very much focused on these dynamics between different levels at which we can materialize strategy. First of all, we have to understand that when we are talking about strategic communication lives in at least 3 different realms. We have political strategic communication, where the key term is soft power. And also security and military strategic communication comes into this realm. Then we have business strategic communication, which is another realm where immaterial assets, intangibles, is the key term. And then we have social strategic communication, which we can also observe on the level of non-governmental organizations, civic organizations, even citizens, if you like, and where the key term is influence. And in the modern society, which I would say we had throughout the majority of the 20th century, those 3 realms were quite differentiated between themselves. It was quite easy to say in which social subsystem you are, what social subsystem you are analyzing when we are talking about research, and also as systems scientists were saying what generalized media of communication exist within which of these social subsystems, so power, money, and trust or influence on the social level. What has happened now in the new millennium is that we can talk about postmodern, hypermodern, whatever modern, we are leaving that modernity behind. And one of the major consequences of this leaving modernity behind is that these lines between these different realms are falling down. And it's not so easy to see what's political, what's economic, what's social, because they're all intermingling. And that's what the internet brought on the technological level. Because internet enables a completely different forms of communication for which we were unprepared for. And in the first phase, so to say, what happened was that we came into what I would call double communication, or even doubling of our lives. We have our physical lives, analog lives, and we are living on social media, on the internet, in blogs, so we have digital lives. What Zuckerberg has announced now, and what Microsoft is also working on, and what other big tech companies are working on now, is how to bring that together again. That's the whole idea of the metaverse. So that we would be living in an integrated analog digital world where 2 different logics are in certain way coming together. Now, what that means for both practice and research of strategic communication. While we were still living in a traditional world, we were living basically in what I'm calling literal society. The major part of our civilization is based on books. You have holy books, you have political books called constitutions, you have laws, and whatever you're trying to do about yourself, if you want to protect your rights, you're always talking about some book. I have these rights as a human, I have these rights as a citizen, I have these rights as this, I have these rights as that. And this knowledge production and this operation of those books has always been linked to the state. So in the end of the day, knowledge is sanctioned by the government, which is the most obvious in traditional medical sciences. So if you want to be a physician, you have to study medicine, you have to graduate, you have to do your practice, and then you get a license, which is a state license, basically. And if you don't agree with official doctrine, either you are going to go out by yourself or you're going to be thrown out. But it's the government at the end of the day which is certifying your knowledge. And a lot of higher education and higher education development throughout the 20th century has been directly linked with the operation of the state and governments. Now the internet has changed all that. If we get sick today, what we do? We Google it first. We look at the Google, what's wrong with us, how we should remedy that, what kind of medicine should we take, and then we go to the doctor and we say, that's wrong with me, please give me that prescription. which means that we are empowering ourselves in completely new ways. And this is happening in all ways of our lives. Now, this removal from this literally based knowledge and this basement on the books is also changing the perception of how general population is perceiving power, knowledge, authority, and so on and so forth. And that's why we have so much problems with authority and trust in institutions these days. Because people are not trusting the traditional forms of power anymore. So the whole production of soft power, intangibles, and social influence is entering in a completely new era. And this era is not so much text-based as it used to be, and our education is basically text-based. We are all academics. How do you get promotion? You have to read and you have to write. You have to write articles, you have to publish articles. If you publish articles, you get promoted. It's very literally literature-based. In this new world in which we are living today, first of all, if you look around, what's gaining attention, and from attention follows influence, are pictures, not words. If you want to be successful on social media, what do? You have to make good films, good pictures. And if you want to manage that, again, you don't need so much words. You need algorithms. So you need numbers. So you have to be numbers literate. So it's a completely new environment in which we are entering, which is going to cause problems on the side of the practice, but also problems on the side of research, because all of our research is still literature-based. And if you look at the analysis of strategic communication, you can see that the majority of that analysis is about content analysis. Even when we are talking about social media, people are downloading posts and analyzing them mainly as texts, which is a very interesting challenge we have in front of us. So where I would like to stop here is that we are really entering a new era, both on the side of academia, because when we are thinking about research, we simply, at the moment, we don't have the tools to grasp this new reality out there, but also on the side of the practice, because people we have educated and we have trained for strategic communication, they were all primarily text-based trained people, which have to operate now in this new brave world, which is going to be great fun for the next century, probably. Thank you.
You sounded so much matrix. I was expecting a red pill and blue pill at the end. Go ahead, Derina.
I would like just to...
Can you press? Yeah.
I keep on forgetting this. Just about what you said about algorithms and the new ways of communicating. I think that's one of our biggest challenges, is bridging the gap between technology and practice. We really are, as Dejan said, still practicing like it was the 20th century. Algorithms is an excellent example of how we have no control over the communication. If we can't sit at the table where the direction of algorithms are determined, then we're not doing our job. What we're doing is we're leaving the writing of algorithms to people with a technological background who do not have the awareness of societal issues, who do not have the awareness of political systems, who do not have, and they write those algorithms based on their own stereotypes. So those algorithms are often written to the exclusion of certain groups of people, and where, that is what algorithms do. They target very specific groups. They're used for segmentation. And so it is the ideal tool to leave out certain population groups that are undesirable, or not include them in your thinking even. So unless we understand how algorithms are written, unless we understand how the technology influences what we do, we are going to have a huge gap in practice.
Thank you, Derina. And I have a question then. This may be stretching a little over like the too much. But when you are talking about the impact of the books and internet, is it the same thing? Are we having a deja vu moment in our long history with when the Gutenberg Bible was first came out and the translation of Bible to literal languages? There was probably, when we go back and see similar debates about the authority of the clergy is shaken, there is now diversification of knowledge, etc. Are we living a similar moment with the emergence of this digital age? And what would be the difference if you compare two of them?
There is a British sociologist, Steve Fuller, who developed the notion of proto-science, which basically says the following. When Gutenberg came with the printed press, what was possible in continental Europe in particular was that it became commercially viable to start translating the Bible into local languages, what on one side enabled believers to see the Holy Word directly, to read it directly, because before that they needed the Catholic Church. The priests had to translate from Latin what it says. Now they could read it directly. That left to Protestantism and the whole way of development of different versions of Protestantism and basically to holy wars in Europe.
Yeah.
That was one side. But on the political side, more important was that translation of the Holy Book into local languages enabled emergence of what we now understand as nations. Because those ethnic groups which wrote their languages at that time were later able to form national communities, which were in major part also produced through literature. Now, that completely changed the perception of authority in holy matters, so to say, in religion. The same thing is now happening with political and scientific authority, because now, as there were people able to read for themselves directly what it says in the Bible, now people are available to read whatever they want on the internet. They have general access to knowledge. There is no knowledge practically outside of the internet, so to say, and that's why everybody feels empowered to interpret what's going by themselves. And this is, if you want to understand what's happening now with the corona pandemic and how people are reacting to vaccination and other measures that have to be taken and how much they believe both health authorities, scientific authorities, and their governments, it's directly related to how they're using the internet now. So yes, I absolutely believe that this is, that's why I'm saying the new era. This is the change we are only starting to see. I believe we are at the beginning now of the major change, not in the middle. We are really at the beginning. This is going to be of the same consequence socially as it was the invention of the printed press. Then it took 100 years, basically, for Europe to feel this major difference. Here, it may be in 2100 that we will really understand what's happening with us only.
Exactly. So I think that there should be a need for social media literacy maybe in the future. Otherwise, every headache you Google, you try to think, like the positively, but you find the first thing that comes to Google is brain tumor. So if you try to search for everything on the Google, you would lead to that anarchy of knowledge, information, anarchy of information, and you would have hard time to maybe distinguish what is really scientific and what is not.
Well, but it was the same when the books arrived, when Goethe wrote the suffering of the Werther, there was a general moral panic that young guys are going to make suicides on the higher note. Then in Victorian England, everybody was concerned now young girls will be able to read all this filthy stuff, so we have to make certain that books are not generally available, and we have to make sure that they understand how to read the books. And again, a lot of our educational system is built around this idea. You cannot have the prohibitorum, as the Pope wanted to have the prohibited books, and we will keep those books out of the public view. But we have to make everybody go to the school, so we will inculturate them in the right way so that they will understand how to read books and know what books are right and what are wrong.
Thank you, Anna. And one of the things, we have been talking about strategic communication, but assessment of it, measuring it is a totally different thing. So there have been debates yesterday about how to measure the success of strategic communication. And tell us a little bit about that.
I want to move to the pragmatic part of the discussion a little bit more. I am also an academic, like all three of us, but I have been conducting a project for 4 years now that is aimed at discovering how strategic communication functions within organizations. So it's aimed at internal communications. And we actually wanted to see, and I think it's important for this panel, how research is connected to being able to do it strategically. We went into organizations and we wanted to see how internal communications actually operates. Is it on a tactical level, or do they do any strategic stuff? Do they really participate in the strategy of an organization?
Are we talking about big organization and size of it?
In our project, we try to include all sizes of organizations, but bigger organizations tend to have bigger departments for internal communications, even though it does apply to small organizations as well, or medium-sized organizations as well. What we found out is that there is always a clash between human resources and corporate communications or strategic communications about who is going to lead the way in many different aspects of internal communication. And now I think this discussion on how the whole digitalization changed this process is especially important for internal communication because it completely changed the landscape. And I think that people in strategic communication should really embrace research because this is going to be the tool to allow them to become strategic in what they do and to take away, if I can put it that way, from human resources and maybe other departments, some of the scope that we feel we need to control. I think that we are going to completely redefine how internal communication operates. I mean, even this conference, in a sense, is a show of that. There is no more, the rules that used to exist don't exist anymore. So now if it is within the scope of internal communications and strategic communications to deal with employer branding, with engagement, with trust, with change management, and these are all the fields that I think should be under the scope of strategic communication, the only way to do it is to do research. Unfortunately, the thing that we also discovered is that people who work in strategic communication don't really like to use research very much. They talk about it a lot, they say that it's very important, they occasionally read books on it, some of them have degrees that taught them some of that stuff, but they don't really use it as much as they say they use it. And even if there is strategic, if there is research in strategic communication, the decisions and the strategies that come out of research are only a few. So if you want to redirect your organization, if you want to, we have a lot of organizations that have issues with employer brands. I don't know if it's the same in Turkey. The landscape is changing. We need new, educated young people. We want people who are hungry, who want to work. We want to attract the best of them into our organizations. I think that even in strategic communication, people feel that to attract these people, to have a good employer brand, is more of a sort of improvisation than a strategy based on research. In order to be able to do this research, I think that practitioners and academics should connect a little bit more. Practitioners should use tools that academics sort of develop and offer through instruments, through methodologies, through approaches, through the whole concept. But also academics should listen more to practitioners and develop things that practitioners really need. It seems that we're not, at least in my experience, I come from a tiny country, so I wouldn't dare say this is universally true, but I think that maybe some of these things are probably exist everywhere. I think that we in academia think everything we do is very important, but then when we have to actually provide solutions that exist in real life for strategic communications, we don't necessarily always do that. So I really saw in practice how lack of research affects strategic communication, especially internally on a high level. And now with the big jump in digitalized communication and the fact that we are all moving online, I think these tools are getting more complicated, but even more important. We really need to understand how people communicate digitally, what changes, what affects us. We've seen an interesting thing in the project because we did half of it before the pandemic and half of it after the pandemic, so we could compare what happened, and we saw that satisfaction with internal communication jumped. It was much higher in the pandemic than before the pandemic, but engagement fell and job satisfaction fell. So I hope we managed to sort of connect a little bit more, the practitioners and the academics, and incorporate real research into strategies, because I think that's the only way forward.
I will, of course, ask Derina what the other part of the world thinks about this, but before that, do you find it challenging to conduct research with this increasing digitalization? Because you have been talking about communication, and most of these communications are now electronic communications, or even WhatsApp messages, instant messaging systems. So how do you kind of evaluate and assess the level of communication? Because those things can be not visible or can disappear at any moment.
We sort of had a real-life experiment with that, as you say, because we had a very elaborate methodology that was designed to do it live, in person, and then all of a sudden, overnight, it all sort of stopped, and we had to redesign it and do it digitally and do it online. And I have to tell you that first I was very worried, and I thought, oh my God, what if I still need half of my data, and the whole world has shut down. What are we going to do? But then I have to say now, after we've managed to do it, if you're resourceful, there are actually things that are better conducted online. Not all of them, and you can't always apply the same solution. You can't take a questionnaire and just sort of apply it digitally. You have to be aware that you can't transfer things automatically. But I think the combination of realizing what's sort of the best of all of these worlds is the perfect solution. We did a lot of interviews via video communication, and you're right. I mean, it doesn't really translate. You cannot get all the information in an interview video-wise that you could in person, because the nonverbal part is a very important element of that.
Of course. I had experience in my own work. We used to have these meetings, track 2 meetings, and they are off-the-record meetings and chat mouse rules. And we never realized that part of the meeting is the social interaction that you had in the lunch, you know, like the traveling, going in the shuttle from one place to another, from hotel to the conference center, etc. But when we try to do it at Zoom, we see it like it's not working, right? We didn't see the same interaction, the same socialization, the same chemistry among the participants. And even in teaching, we started to see that now there's a Zoom fatigue. The first, we really liked it. You know, like technology provides you a lot of opportunities to make your class more colorful, let's say. But at certain point, you need that social interaction. Maybe it is time to think a little bit hybrid, you know, like how to create a little bit hybrid strategic communication so that there will be a part of social interaction, a chemistry, and at the same time the digital sphere, which make it easier, fast, and much more interactive maybe. And Derina, go ahead.
To really link into what Anna said, I think she raised an incredibly important component, something that we really haven't researched a lot, and that is virtual organizations. And how do we communicate in virtual organizations? There are companies now who close their physical offices and go virtual. How do we bond our employees around a vision and a mission in a virtual environment? You know, the fact is that each employee is still a representative of the organization. We often talk about the fact that reputation is not determined by the head office. Reputation is determined also by the actions of everybody. Again, that emerging importance of employees is very important. And if we cannot influence the behavior or the attitudes of virtual employees, we are going to be in a great deal of trouble. So that is another challenge that's facing us. The tools are there. We know what a virtual organization is. We have done research on that already. But interestingly enough, the people who were virtual workers were the managers and not the regular people whom you think would, be the ideal solution. So that is a very important component of what we need to study is virtual employees, their effect on reputation, and the effect on on organizational culture.
The second part, when she was talking about how the practice and academia is kind of their relation in terms of strategic communication in organizations. And she gave an example about her own country. How about in the United States? Do you think they inform each other? Do you think there is enough interaction between academia and practice when it comes to strategic communication of the organization?
Yeah, I do think that in general, practitioners really embrace academics and vice versa. That is a very integrated, there are organizations where the two groups really meet each other and share their knowledge. So yeah, I think it is, and it is very, 20 years ago the concept of activism in public relations didn't exist. Now they all practice activism, it comes from academics, and so hopefully this will carry over into the practice.
We have just 1 minute left. Then, your opinion about the interaction between academia and practice?
Well, I think that both academia and practice at the moment are quite conservative if you look at the mainstream. I just saw a couple of months ago there was an article published in Public Relations Review which analyzes 1,000 employment ads for professional communicators, and out of that came that the most sought after proficiency was in written communication. In this new reality, what I think is that we have to develop 4 different set of skills in our students which are entering the practice, and in practice we have to be very attentive to these 4 types of skills. But I would say we have traditional communication skills, what we are teaching now in communication schools. What's coming up and what we have already mentioned is computer programming and being able to understand what's going on the internet. The third one, which is extremely important, is business, so that we understand how we are using resources, because only recently communication became so much important that serious money is invested in it. Previously it was peanuts, so nobody cared how we spent that money. And the fourth one, which we are not considering enough, is arts, artistic communication, because as a lot of communication is these days becoming visual, unless you understand the logic of production of this visual communication, you are missing the whole point. And let me give you one simple example. September 11th. Traditional political and security sciences analyze it as a terrorist attack. From communication point of view, we have to see that it was planned and executed as a visual performance. Think about the pictures on the television. Those were planned pictures. That's why the impact was so big, because it was a visual performance. And unless we understand this strength of visual performances, that new technology is enabling us, and it's going to go further very fast from visual to experiential, now with metaverse and many wearable technologies we already use now. Anna, do you have your Fitbit? She's tracking everything she's doing. If you want to ask her, how do you sleep? How did you sleep last night? She's going to watch at her Fitbit and look at the Fitbit, at the score, how well she slept. So wearables are
I actually look at the phone, I just have to say, not at the Fitbit. It shows you're not watching what I do.
I do want to...
Well, now there is even an app that measures if you are snoring or not. So it can even give you that information.
Just in conclusion, to add to what Dejan said, we are starting a bachelor's BA degree in media and arts in our college next fall, where incoming students can choose how they want to put their degree together in terms of mixing media and the arts, a component of computer science, and the result must be a final project like a senior thesis where they put all of that together in one bit, because we do understand how important the arts, maybe it is, you know, I'm in that privileged position that I'm a Dean of Fine Arts and Communication, and so we'll see how that goes, but that is sort of our solution to that issue that Dejan is.
I think it is happening all over the campuses. In my university, Penn State University, we started a new major in School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Digital Studies. And I was one of the professors who were a little skeptic, because I'm like, go classic, right? Just, you know, like to go with the standard established majors.
Yeah.
And in a very short period of time, we see the enrollments to Digit is increasing. And the most significant part of it is multidisciplinarity. That you can be programmer, you can be social scientist, you can be communication major, but you can still do that. With this note, we have to complete this conversation, and thank you very much, Dan, Derina, and Anna, for coming to Istanbul and having this conversation. It was an interesting conversation. We could continue actually this conversation for a long period of time, but I'm getting the messages that we have to stop here. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks for joining us today. Thank you very much.